Hello and welcome to the Health Tech Marketing Show. I'm your host, Adam Chirinis. I'm the CEO of Health Launchpad. My firm, Health Launchpad, produces this podcast, and we do it in partnership with HIMSS. I want to give a big thank you to HIMSS for your long-standing support. Really very grateful to you for that. I'm also grateful to anybody who's listening and anybody who's watching. We really appreciate your support. We know we've got group of regular users and really do appreciate it. And if this happens to be like the first time you're listening to this show, you can see the video, and we also write a blog post about it, which you can get a link in the show notes to that. And conversely, if you want to subscribe to this, we're on all the major podcast channels. So Spotify, Apple, all those guys. One last thing. Yeah, if you like the show and you think, hey, I really learned something today, and that's certainly our goal here, please send it to your friends. Think of 2 people who might benefit from it and send them a link. They'll thank you for it, and certainly I will thank you for it. So I appreciate it. So today we are covering a topic that I've not covered before, which can't think why I haven't. It's one of my favorite topics, and that's about user experience, website design, and building digital brands in healthcare. This is a topic I've got a lot of passion for. And I'm so excited to have Juan and Mike from Atomic Health here with me. I met them at the Sway show. So big shout out to Sway. You always do amazing stuff. And was just blown away by the work that they're doing, and thought, we do websites at Health Launchpad, but I'm really impressed with the work that they're doing. And so I thought I'd get them on the show. We'll have a chat about digital brands, UX, and website design. So give us your intro. Tell us a story about you guys and your firm and what's going on in Miami, because I think that's where you guys are based, right?
That's right. We are. Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. And thank you for having us on the show. So as you mentioned, we're from Atomic Health. Myself and Juan were partners here. We go way back. So we've spent the last 15 plus years on the other side of the house, working within a kind of venture-backed health tech venture, and really learned a lot of experience, not only in building software, building brands and marketing programs and launching products, but also partnering with hundreds, if not thousands, of physicians, health systems, hospitals, and then working on the patient side as well. So with Atomic Health, really, we call ourselves an experience design agency. Essentially, the way we think about that, how that breaks down, is we help health tech, digital health, and life science companies with some kind of center of technology in the gravity of in the center, with everything from branding, visual identity, website and digital experiences, as well as product UI UX, which also incorporates research and design systems and a bunch of other cool stuff I'm sure we'll get to today. As you mentioned, we do have a few folks here based in Miami, but we're really a distributed company, have folks all across the country, and work with clients as well that really are positioned really globally at this point. So
great. And so what, Mike and Juan, what are your respective roles within your firm? Who does what?
Why don't you take that one?
Great. So Mike is really the creative director. He really runs all of the creative aspects of the organization, and I run the operations, or the operational aspects of the organization. And I think the thing that's really interesting about Atomic Health and why we think it's really resonating with our clients has been that the thesis was very simple. In order to do well in healthcare, you have to know healthcare, and I think that's something in this that this audience really understands and can appreciate. Having been in the space for 20 plus years, and as Mike mentioned, over the last 15 years together, working, day in and day out, building products, taking them to market, et cetera, I think it's really given us an incredible opportunity to see all the different kind of areas in which healthcare kind of touches people's lives. And what we wanted to do with Atomic Health was, how do we bring some of that incredible design DNA to the rest of the market?
And so what you mentioned about healthcare expertise. Tell us about what's so different about doing the type of work that you do in healthcare as opposed to doing, I don't know, financial services or travel or consumer packaged goods? What's the difference?
Yeah, Adam, I think there's a couple of different layers to that. First and foremost, I think if you're going to be doing a large design project, whether it's a brand refresh, brand relaunch, let's say it's a whole new website, or you're going to be working with somebody for the long haul to really reimagine your product experience, you're going to be spending a lot of time with those folks. And so having a shared language and ethos and that experience, I think, brings a lot to the table. Number one, the fidelity of the conversations they're faster, they're better, they're higher bandwidth conversations. We also can kind of skip some steps. So we've heard quite often, we were working with this agency, but we had to explain to them, the healthcare 101 terms, right? And so we can kind of just hit the ground running, speaking that same language.
Yeah, I get that, but what's actually difference in terms of like the consumer experience? Yeah. I mean, what is it? Is there something difference about healthcare consumers?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about healthcare in particular is that you're serving a lot of different personas almost simultaneously, right? So as you think about clinicians and admin folks and patients and caregivers, all with very unique needs, all with very different kind of perspectives or frameworks of how they approach in the industry as a whole, or how they're participating in that industry. You really have to be mindful of what it is that they're trying to accomplish and what it is that really resonates with them, and designing a UX that accounts for all of those very particular kind of pathways that they go down within the market. So understanding those, I would say, not at a superficial level, but at a deep level, is incredibly important, especially
is there a difference, you think, in terms of how consumer? I mean, we're talking about patient experiences here, right? So what is it that's different about the way a consumer behaves as a patient than they do as, say, a car buyer?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Adam. There's a lot of expectations, I think, that are different in terms of how patients interact in the healthcare ecosystem, right? So typically patients, when they're interacting with their doctor's office, it's one of two reasons: either they don't feel great, right? Or they're trying to be preventative in some kind of care. And I think understanding that it's a very emotional kind of journey that these patients are on. And I think having the empathy and understanding that journey that patient is on, and also being able to use language that speaks to the type of situation that they might find themselves in, whether it's a great situation or not so great situation, understanding that and having dealt with being on the inside of medical practices and across all different kinds of specialties. There's a very big difference between dermatology practices and oncology practices and the types of patients that they serve. And knowing that at kind of that deeper level helps us kind of understand those nuances.
Yeah, you mentioned the patient journey. How do you kind of analyze the patient journey, and what's the role that takes in the type of work that you do?
Yeah, so if we're working with a company, as Juan mentioned, I think oftentimes many B2B brands in particular, or just healthcare brands in general, it really is multiple personas they're serving. Let's say they're trying to sell to a provider organization. So you have the clinical side, you have the administrative side, and quite often you have the consumer or the patient side as well. So I think that myriad of folks and accounting for how they all kind of interact and transact throughout. But I also think at the center of it is how we map that out and how we say, what are those critical touch points, and how are we going to kind of bring the consistency of the brand forward, making it a consistent language with ethos that crosses throughout, but also relevant and timely. And I don't want to use the word personalized, but more appropriate for that persona. So you're not going to speak, obviously, to a cardiologist in the same way you're going to speak to a caretaker or a caregiver on the patient side.
I'm curious. It's going to get a little tactical, but it's something I'm kind of interested in, and that is when you create for different personas, and some of them may be clinical, some of them may be business, or how do you, when you're designing the UX of the website, do you create pathways that you want, say, a different type of persona to go down?
Yeah, we call those journeys. Oftentimes, usually when we're working with a marketing organization, we call those more buyer journeys. And then if it's a more general project, more enterprise-wide, it might be user journeys, right? And there's on-ramps. How do they get to that journey? If it's a buyer doing research, it could be through social or SEO, or it could be on the front door of the homepage. If it's on the patient side, oftentimes that is actually through, it's more of a B2B2C kind of pathway, where they might not be directly interacting with the brand, but the brand is there and they may understand this is powered by, as an example. So depending our scope, we might kind of look at that whole overall ecosystem, that what we call it, that digital ecosystem, and then kind of see like where do those paths cross potentially. The trick is, for most brands, having that layer of continuity, but also specificity that's appropriate for the persona level.
I'm confused. So when you say the ecosystem, like give me an example of like was it like from shifting from health grades to a website, or from HIMSS to a
so a company may have a platform. That platform may have kind of data that is being informed to fuel some of the value that people are buying from. That platform then has end user applications that a business user may use that also may touch a clinical user as well. And there may be satellite experiences that then touch like a patient, for instance. I'm using very broad terms, but the idea is that all that data and workflow and kind of how you get folks to interact and onboard onto the platform and actually utilize it and get value out of it. There's many different touch points that touch and traverse many segments and user types.
And how do you use data and analytics in either your design process or in actually instead of optimizing, site optimization? How do you do that?
Yeah, so if we focus a little more on the marketing side, I would say that we like to talk about the diversity of data in the sense of it's qualitative and quantitative. So obviously you want to look at things like your website analytics, Google Analytics, things like that. How are users interacting with content? How are they converting, et cetera? But also the conversations, the qualitative side, whether those are internal stakeholders, external users. Many of the brands that we work with, they're actually asking us to help focus on where we're going. So the data helps inform, but data is typically historical and it can't always tell you where you're going. So whether it's breaking into a new segment, a new market, a new product offering that you may have. And the other side I would say is that sometimes data can help you make the right case. So for instance, a company who's trying to go to a new segment and they're saying, okay, we want to blow up our sitemap. We don't want this solution section or these use case sections. We might come back and say, hey, actually, we did an SEO analysis. These keywords and content is actually performing really well. Maybe it's not exactly where you want to go, but I wouldn't completely blow that up. Let's keep that. Right. That's working for you today. So for us, I do think we think a lot about intuition is just as important as just strictly looking at the data, but they both go hand in hand and they inform the overall strategy moving forward.
Right. I think the other thing that's important too is that you should always be mindful and never overlook the competitive landscape, right? Understand what, and benchmark your designs against what other folks are doing, right, in the field, ensuring that you're always really, at least what we try to do is that we're always really trying to push the envelope on what healthcare design is while being appropriate, right? But pushing that envelope on the design and on the UX side. So I think this data-driven strategy plus that intuition, which I think Mike alluded to, is incredibly important. I think that's a little bit of the secret sauce that allows you to, do great, but also have it look great, but also perform simultaneously.
Tell me more about intuition. I know what the word means. I'm not sure I get what, in the context of what you're describing, where that fits in.
That fits a little more on the strategy and creative side. So the data will tell you, and particularly sometimes on the product side. So while we want to follow a strict human-centered design process oftentimes and UX, and again, listen to users, if you just built what users told you they're looking for, you may not end up with something that truly is a breakout. So that's where I think when we think about the people that we bring onto our projects and based on our experience, it's kind of having a little bit more vision, right? And kind of saying, well, what if it was this? What if it was that? And where the data sits into that part is actually validation, right? So the data, may not tell the full story of what you have to always go build or design against, but you certainly can then bring that to the market, to an audience, and say, hey, is this something that resonates with you? Whether it's
right.
A different kind of design aesthetic, or it's a product experience that maybe others hadn't quite thought of. It's really bringing that kind of inspiration, that creativity to the table, And we have different ways to do that, whether it's workshopping, being more generative. Just, we have this exercise, we'll do crazy eights. And like within 5 minutes, we'll have to every person has to generate 8 different ideas for this one given problem, right? And so the problem is rooted in data, but what users have told us would be the solution is not the thing that we're just kind of blindly creating and following and saying, this is what you're going to go build.
Got it. Okay. So it is, what I like about what you're saying is a balance between using analytics to understand the consumer behavior and to making decisions about parts of the site, the content, but then also the creative side of things, which is, you can't really use data for, which is the different ideas and the sort of the different expression, the art. So the art, it's the art and the science, right?
That's right.
Another way to say it is, you have, let's say you look at a certain category and you say, hey, every company in this segment is using, X color or X font, or they're all using, stock photography. Well, you might say, well, that's great. Maybe there's a reason they're all doing that, but let's actually take a step back and say, what might be a different way to do it? What might be a different way to kind of have a whole different aesthetic and kind of break out of it? So it's listening to the data, but then ultimately kind of using your instinct and intuition.
Yeah. What I appreciate about the sites that I've seen that you've designed is they're beautifully designed. And I mean that both in terms of sort of aesthetic, but also in terms of intuitiveness. So we talked about intuition. Let's talk about intuitiveness. What do you, how do you go about designing an experience so that it's highly usable?
I think being really, really focused on the user that you're after is the foundational element. That gets harder, obviously, as you account for different user types. But really, if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. So that's the most foundational aspect. Mm-hmm. I also think simple is hard. So you can look at an experience and say, wow, what a great tagline, what a great big clean button. But that thing was discussed, debated, scrutinized. There was probably 17 different versions of it before we put it forward. And then kind of where we started the other conversation, not looking at just a section on the site, just the hero or just the button or the call to action. It's the overall experience. So we're really thinking through, how do people start on the site? How do they end on this, or how do they go through it? What are they actually trying to learn? What's that buyer journey? And how do we ultimately get them into whatever metric or outcome we're measuring, whether it's a conversion or a click or engagement, et cetera. So it really is that flow of going through that experience rather than just kind of thinking of spot little pieces that then kind of you put together to kind of hopefully deliver a site.
And Adam, I would say, as Mike being a former head of marketing and me leading sales or strategy in our previous lives, appreciate the kudos on the beautifully designed site and simple, but sites have to perform, right? That's what it's also all about. And having that perspective and being able to come in and say, okay, like, how are you thinking about conversion rate optimization? How are those buyer journeys? What are the different entry points? A lot of the work that you're doing, right? How do we work with those teams to ensure that it's not only beautiful, it's also functional and it's performance, right? And it really ultimately drives, more conversions, which is what they're ultimately looking for.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, but it's a trade-off, right? Because if you were just designing for intuitiveness, every website would look like Google.
Right.
And clearly that's not what you do. So how do you mentioned about sort of leading through a buyer journey and conversions. I'm curious about, tips that you might have on terms of if you're trying to get somebody through an experience, how do you design it? Do you do everything on one page? Which, the sort of the one page website, it's kind of, it seems to have faded out, thankfully, as a best practice. Or do you, what do you do to get people to go from one page to the next page so that you can lead them through that journey, but you can also track them doing it?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, it's going to be an experiment. That's just a fact. So you're going to take your best guess based on the data, based on the ideation that we put forth, and say, so what we'll do is we'll do scenarios. We'll say you have a top of funnel buyer who's maybe doing some initial research, and they're going to just kind of be trying to get like a lay of the land of what you do. You're going to have a middle of funnel, maybe, really looking at maybe a case study, that kind of thing. And then somebody who's like really ready to buy, right? And or maybe already in the pipeline phase and you're kind of looking for more acceleration. So it's the proof points, and they're kind of going deeper on the product and that sort of thing. You kind of come up with those scenarios, and then as that gets out into market, you can bring the data perspective back and say, hey, look, people are actually really intrigued on this thing. I mean, we've done stuff where we do heat maps, and you could see certain elements, call outs, whether it's proof points or the right content at the right time, that really kind of lights up like a Christmas tree, where you're seeing people actually really kind of engaging into it. And so I would say you're never going to know up front. You can have an informed guess, but also building in that modularity into a site experience so that you can then quickly build that out and test and optimize without having to always go back to your agency and say, hey, I want to make this change to this section. Like, okay, yeah, grab this component, bring it in, run the test, and then check back in a few weeks.
And you can also borrow concepts, right? The fact that we do both branding and product UI UX, you can borrow concepts from different disciplines. As an example, right? As you're building out websites, we think about websites as living, breathing products that, online products that should be constantly evolving. So, for example, if you wanted to bring in the principle of progressive disclosure, right, where you only present the most relevant information up front, right, where you allow the user to kind of dive deeper as needed, it keeps the kind of overall experience intuitive and clean, but it allows you to prioritize kind of the design elements and ensuring that you reduce as much cognitive load up front, and you kind of lead them through this journey. And you see that happen a lot in product design principles, and how people, how we build and how folks build product. I think you can do the same as you're building and rethinking, your website experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The hardest thing is designing the homepage, because it's a decision about what doesn't go on it. And I'm guilty of this, because I found my first website, looked like a fridge with magnets on it. It had everything on it, right? And then it was like just putting stuff off, and then eventually getting it down to how do you get, work with clients to say, okay, let's make a decision about what's going to go on it, and then what's not going to go on it.
It's the most contested digital real estate in a company, typically, right? The bigger you go, the more important it becomes. I think we've learned a couple of things along the way. I think that, again, general, because every company is going to be a little bit different and a different stage of their own journey. But oftentimes, you want to open up with, in that first 3 seconds, 2 seconds, how do you send the brand message forward, generally speaking, right?
Yeah.
Really kind of help somebody resonate with why you matter as a company, why you're different, and it just needs to stick, because that's the fastest way they're going to bounce. They see something, I'm out. And we can have lots of conversations around, is it a stock photo? There's I think, everyone's already used the same photo over and over again, right? How interactive should it be, right? Should there be some kind of element that kind of intrigues the user? And then from there, I think the general way we think about it is, and we have different models. So, obviously ADA is one. We have a few others that we've kind of built in-house that kind of just goes a little bit deeper for a more B2B buyer, where there's more like proof points and validation. And then, they may not be ready to actually look into a product. So you kind of want to serve something that might be more informative, or kind of just, help them tell that bigger story, or a resource for them, et cetera. So I would say that the goal that we typically think of for a homepage is not for them to click. Often you want it to be there, but not click demo or see demo or reach out or talk to a salesperson. You really want to try to get them to the most relevant part of the site. So you think of it as kind of like a filter, and saying, okay, how can we have enough depth, enough diversity in the overall experience to say, if you're an applicant, you're going to have a great experience understanding about this company and understanding why you want to work here. If you are a prospect that's not ready to buy, you can leave with an impression that says, hey, this company is doing something really cool, and maybe I got something really valuable out of it. And then lastly, if there's somebody that's kind of ready to raise their hand, you make that a really, really seamless experience. So it's tough because it's a lot of different people. You have HR, you have even sometimes customer success saying, hey, what about the people that are looking for support, et cetera. But ultimately, I think that is the job of the homepage, is to really be that kind of air traffic control and say, let's get you to the proper site. But most importantly, let's leave that lasting impression to hopefully get you to come back in the future.
Right. It really does set the tone, right, for the overall website experience.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. You talked about brand, and that's certainly part of what you do. How do you do? How do you approach brand? I mean, everybody's got a different way of doing it. different language, definitions mean different things. What's your approach?
Sure. So I would say first and foremost for us, we want to be a true partner, a creative partner. And to do that, we have to kind of immerse ourselves in the company. That could be, for a larger company, that could take a little bit more because you have to kind of talk to a lot of folks and really understand where they want to go. For a smaller startup, there's a sprint process that we can take. But that's the first step, is the discovery and the context. And a lot of what we're doing there is really defining the true scope. So, we want to rebrand, we want to refresh. No, we just need a little bit of a better looking site. Like really understanding why and kind of pushing sometimes and saying, you think you want this, but actually your users think your site's fine. You just need to be improving X, Y, and Z. Or no, this thing is really off. You really need to be positioning yourselves here. So really understanding where we're going and getting clarity there is the first most important part. Once we go into the creative process, that's where it gets a little messier. And that's kind of where we roll up our sleeves and it gets a lot of fun. So we'll do like your typical things, like a tonal slider, and really understand where you are today versus where you want to go. Is it authoritative versus friendly, exclusive versus accessible, durable versus disruptive, and tech forward? Those kind of things. Just get like those characteristics on the table to really understand like where is the company, where do you want to go, and where do you think your market is going to resonate most from an aesthetic perspective. Oftentimes, if we're driving the brand strategy, which is the positioning and the overall messaging as well, we'll kind of be doing the overall story and narrative as it relates to how the visual will kind of ultimately manifest. And then, without going into like every specific step, I would say the highlights of what we do that we think are really interesting and create a lot of value for the companies that we work with is, and something that we would implore them to do, even if they're doing it in-house, is we generate a lot of explorations. So we'll do something that might be called like a stylescape, which is essentially a mix of typography, the color story, different ways to visualize your graphics. If you're showing your UI, is it the actual version of the UI? Is it an illustrated version? Are there more icons? Are we illustrating people? Are we using photos? Is it custom photography? All those different elements. And we bring that together into kind of a shared overall board, essentially. There have been clients where we generate 20 of those just to kind of explore.
Yep.
And sometimes it's because, wow, this is so good, but it's not quite who we are, right? And we really want to ultimately try to find the way to find the best version of that company to express themselves. Sometimes, we get really close initially and we're just kind of like really refining and figuring it out. But we find that's the most kind of most efficient way to kind of showcase to internal stakeholders, executives, like this is what your new company is going to look like. It might not be exactly how it's going to look, but this is kind of where it's shaping up and directionally.
How do you, it's great hearing you describe that. How do you help them make a decision? Because you're showing them something which is, very subjective, right? It's like, should you be blue? Should you be green? Should you make a really bold decision and be red? Should you use this type of time? It's such a subjective decision.
So a couple of things.
How do you read them?
Yeah, I think the data, not the data, but the constraints or the realities are also pretty important. So what are your touch points? Are you fully digital? Do you have physical aspects as well? What's the competitive aspect of it? So, are there other companies that are doing something you want to differentiate, or do you kind of want to be more of a chameleon and just kind of, startups want to look like big companies and big companies want to look like startups. That's kind of the trend that we see quite often. And then I would say the last 2 points are, bringing in the right stakeholders. So we don't like when it's just kind of a smaller group sometimes, and then they're saying, okay, well, we're not going to show everybody until we're a little bit further along, which sometimes you need to do because they want to move fast. But oftentimes the more, a lot of folks in these companies, they are mission driven. They have a strong sense of ethos. And what we've found is people can see things and say, you know what, that feels like us. That feels like the new us, right? And then to tilt the scale, we can actually go to market and we can kind of go and show this to prospects, show this to people outside and say, what's a preference test, right? And what are they kind of leaning against? And so those are some of the ways that we try to kind of at least bring more of that kind of decision criteria to the table to ultimately give them something that they're going to be comfortable with and say, this is absolutely, who we are.
And then once they make that decision, Adam, I would encourage companies to think about using design as a superpower, right? And really, really embrace their new brand, their new design, and ensure that touches all kind of aspects of how they go to market, everything from the front door of their brand, their website, to all their customer touch points, even to their product, and really leverage that. And the best way I can describe it is use design as a superpower. And I think you'll find that once they do that, they do start setting themselves apart in the market.
I love that concept. Who do you think does it well in healthcare?
I'll let Mike answer that.
Who does it well? I think there's a lot of companies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to call out clients because I think there are some that have really,
you can do that if you want.
I think H1 is a company we've worked with. That is
yeah, I know those guys. Yeah,
really good job.
Yeah.
Yeah. We worked with them a few years back.
I think we had Lizzie Feliciano on the show.
Oh yeah, she's great.
She's great.
Great friend of the firm. I think they really cared about the brand that they were doing. They really leaned in from the CEO to across the organization. We did a lot of exploration for them to really find the soul of that company. Mm-hmm. And as Juan alluded to, it wasn't just a website. It was, a full-on refresh. Every touch point, I think, kind of followed suit. And it's something that, from sales to customer touch point, et cetera, it's all kind of woven in. And the ethos of that visual narrative is really expressed. And I think it's also something that we built in flexibility and kind of modularity into it in the sense that it's evolved over time. So they haven't had to, durability, I think, in these kind of efforts is important. And so with that same foundation, they've been able to extend, launch new products, go into new market segments, and all still feel very consistent and very within the vein of what they ultimately were trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's a good example. It's an interesting one because H1, such a simple name, I still struggle to. What they do is quite complicated. It's quite difficult to get your head around, actually. So it's a very good example.
That was one of the most challenging from a logo perspective because it's an H and a 1, and if you actually look at most typefaces, the H and the 1 are very similar in almost any typeface.
Interesting.
It's just like the two, the two lines with the center and then the 1. And so we did a lot of work to really try to find the expression and get the ethos of the whole idea of connecting the healthcare ecosystem together in that one little mark. And so yes, you're dead on. Like from a pure graphic perspective on that identity mark, it was a unique challenge.
Typeface is fascinating, right? I think it's something which if anybody outside design's like, it's a typeface. I mean, just use Comic Sans.
You should see the Slack conversations on our Atomic Health Slack just about fonts alone.
I think there should be. I think there should be a constitutional amendment banning Comic Sans. So that's a really interesting example. So guys, this has been such an interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Just each of you, if I can leave you with one sort of parting thought, like a best practice, one best practice you wish people would do, and one sort of so-called best practice you wish they'd ignore.
Ignore. Look, I think, as I mentioned, validating as early and often as you can sounds obvious, but particularly on the product side, the cheapest way to validate is through a design prototype. The most expensive is code in production, right? And so I think we try to really help push clients to do that, to say as quickly as we can, let's just get in front of somebody and get some kind of feedback. And I would say as a precursor to that, accessibility is not an afterthought, right? So as you're thinking about just who's going to be accessing your site, is it easy to understand, legible, color ratios, all those kind of things? You never want to be going back after and then having to clean that stuff up. I think, and then the last thing I would say is thinking of scale early, particularly on the design system side. So the tools have gotten incredibly flexible for companies to really make sure that their system can be adopted, design system, brand system can be adopted consistently across the organization, and really building something that is a resource across the organization to build those brand materials, build those touch points, and build those campaigns.
Yeah. And I would say, I think that's great, Mike. That's going to be tough to follow. I would say as a reformed salesperson, what I would tell you is sales teams use the brand, right? Embrace it, embrace kind of the templates that have been built, particularly Sales reps, marketing teams are living and dying by their decks, right? And the stories that they're trying to craft and say, and the narratives that they're trying to put forth into the market. So I would say leverage that. But the thing that I would also say is you may need to ignore that at times, because those decks, the way that they're built, don't necessarily always evolve, or it doesn't really fit the narrative that you're trying to say. So I would argue that it's important to work with an internal design team, with a partner, with somebody that really tries to capture, what it is that you're trying to say effectively, and bring that to life in a beautiful and a well thought, a thoughtful manner, so that people can very clearly understand it. So leverage your decks, leverage your brand, and those templates, but oftentimes that doesn't work. So it's okay to break the mold there.
That's great. Thank you. Those are great best practices from both of you. Juan and Mike, I want to thank you for your time today. I've learned a lot, and this is a subject I've been involved in web design and brand design for decades, and so it's always really interesting to get different perspectives on it. And I've certainly got some different ideas from our conversations. So thank you both.
Great. This is great, Adam. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So I want to thank everybody out there for listening. And again, if you like what you heard and you want to share it. Just put it on social media, put it on LinkedIn, and email your friends. And by the way, Juan and Mike, how can people get in touch with you and your firm?
Sure, they can just go to atomic.health.
How easy is that? It's brilliant. It's good branding. Yeah, you won't be disappointed. So I will thank you again, and thank you everybody for listening. See you next time.
Take care.
Thank you, Adam.